All right, let's take you to Geneva, where Vladimir Putin just wrapped up his meeting with President Biden. Putin is taking questions. Let's listen.
Maybe you can dwell on the topics that you discussed in more detail. For instance, have you discussed the Ukrainian topic? Have you discussed the situation in Donbass and possible Ukraine accession to NATO? And in the run-up to negotiations, there were a lot of expectations of ambassadors returning to their host countries. Your assistant, Mr. Ushakov, talked on that. Have you decided on that? With regard to return of ambassadors to their workplaces,
Moscow.
Return of American ambassador to Moscow and our ambassador to Washington, we agreed that they would return to their service, to their duties.
But when specifically
As for the timeline,
the day after tomorrow, that's a
tomorrow
mere technical
or
issue.
the day after, this is pure technicality. We agreed that
the U.S. State Department,
Russian MFA and State Department will start consultations on the whole range of issues
on the
of diplomatic cooperation. There's a lot to talk about. A lot of questions have piled up. I believe that both parties, including the United States, seek to find common ground and find solutions. As for Ukraine, indeed, we touched upon this matter. I wouldn't say that we had lengthy conversation on that, but as far as I understood, President Biden, he said that the basis for the Ukrainian settlement should be the Minsk package of measures. As for possible Ukraine accession to NATO, well, we just touched upon this.
This issue was
broadly, and there's nothing to discuss here.
That is what
Itar Tass, news agency.
The general line.
Please give the floor to Itar Tass.
Question from Itar Tass.
Mr. President, you said that one of the topics was strategic stability. Could you please elaborate on the decisions on this matter? And will Russia and the United States resume or launch negogations on strategic stability and disarmament, and namely on the New START treaty? Do you plan to start negotiations on the...
I can hear you.
All right, we're gonna flip over to a different translation option. It's a little difficult to hear this one, so we're hoping our other option is a little clearer. And I think we've done that, so let's depend.
The US and Russia hold special responsibility for strategic stability in the world, judging by the fact that we are the largest nuclear powers in terms of the number of warheads, re-entry vehicles, and delivery means, as well as the quality and the scale of modernity of these weapons. We realize this responsibility, and President Biden took a responsible and timely decision to extend the New START treaty by another 5 years till 2024. Indeed, the question arises, what's next? We agreed that we will launch consultations at the interagency level under the auspices of the US State Department and the Russian Foreign Ministry. Colleagues at the working level will decide on the makeup of these delegations and the venue for negotiations, as well as the schedule of these meetings. Let's give the floor to foreign journalists. CNN, Matthew Chance.
Hi, Matthew Chance from CNN. Thank you very much for giving me this question. First of all, could you characterize the dynamic between yourself and President Biden? Was it hostile or was it friendly? And secondly, throughout these conversations, did you commit to ceasing carrying out cyber attacks on the United States? Did you commit to stopping threatening Ukraine's security? And did you commit to stop cracking down on the opposition in Russia?
Значит, первая общая оценка. Я считаю, что не было никакой враждебности, наоборот, наша встреча происходила, конечно, в принципиальном ключе. У нас по многим позициям наши
in a constructive spirit. Indeed, we have varied assessments on a number of issues, but both sides expressed their intention to understand each other and to seek common ground. Talks were quite constructive.
Что касается кибербезопасности, мы договорились о том, что мы начнем на этот счет консультации.
Begin consultations in this respect. I believe it is extremely important. As for responsibilities and who should take them, let me brief you on matters that are common knowledge, but probably not everybody is aware of that. US sources, I don't want to make a mistake here as to the name of this organization, but the US sources claim that the majority of cyber attacks are made from the US territory. Then the second one is Canada, then two Latin American states, and then the UK. As for Russia, it is not listed in this ranking of countries that see the significant number of cyber attacks from their territory. That's one thing. Secondly, throughout 2020, we have received 10 requests regarding cyber attacks. Attacks on the US infrastructure. As our colleagues put it, these cyber attacks were launched from the Russian territory. And we received 2 such requests this year, and on all these requests, our colleagues received exhaustive answers. On its turn, Russia sent last year 45 such requests to the relevant agencies of the United States, and this year we sent 35 requests, and no response has been provided so far. That says that we have a lot to work on, and as for the scale of responsibilities and who should take them, it should be decided within negotiations. We agreed that we would start such consultations, and we believe that the cyber security area is extremely important in the world at large, for the United States in particular, as well as for the Russian Federation to the same extent. For instance, we know about cyber attacks against a pipeline organization in the United States, and we know that this company had to pay a ransom of $5 million USD. According to my information, they were returned some parts of this money from electronic wallets, but some parts of this money is still missing. But what does and what do Russian authorities have to do this? We face similar threats when it comes to one of the key Russian regions and its healthcare system, and we see where these cyber attacks are launched from. We see that these attacks are coordinated from the United States territory. I don't think that the United States authorities are interested in such kind of manipulations. We need to get rid of all kinds of insinuations and innuendo, and we should launch the expert work for the benefit of the United States and the Russian Federation. We have reached an agreement in principle of that, and Russia is ready to do that.
Арти, дайте микрофон Арти, пожалуйста.
Please give the mic to Arti.
Какая-то часть вопроса была осталась неотвеченной.
Yeah, I believe some part of the question was not answered.
That's correct, and thank you very much for coming back to me, sir. So there were 2 other parts of the question. The first one is, did you commit in these meetings to stop threatening Ukraine? Remember, the reason this summit was called in the first place, or the timing of it, was when Russia was building up lots of forces across the border from Ukraine. And the second part of the question, the third part of the question, was, did you commit to stopping your crackdown against the opposition groups inside Russia led by Alexei Navalny?
Значит, ну, я не слышал эту часть вопроса, или ее не
to be
перевели, или
honest,
вы
this part of the question was not
подумали и решили
interpreted, or
задать второй
maybe
вопрос. Что
you
касается
decided to
обязательств
ask
по
a
поводу
second part of your question.
Украины,
But with
у
regards
нас
to
обязательство только одно
commitments
–
to
способствовать реализации
Ukraine, we
Минских
have one
соглашений.
single commitment to
Если
help
украинская
and
сторона готова к
facilitate the
этому, мы
implementation of the
пойдем
Minsk
по этому
agreements.
пути,
If
без
the Ukrainian
всякого
side is
сомнения.
ready to do that, we are
Между
ready
прочим,
to
хочу
follow
обратить
this
ваше
path
внимание на
without
следующее.
any
Еще
doubts.
в ноябре прошлого
Let
года
me draw your attention to one thing.
украинская
In
делегация
November
представила
2020,
свои
the
соображения
Ukrainian
о том,
delegation presented
как
its
она думает
ideas
реализовывать
on
Минские
how it
соглашения.
intends to implement the Minsk
Смотрите, пожалуйста, это
agreements.
не секретный документ. Там
And
написано, что
it's not a
прежде
confidential
всего нужно
document. It
представить
stipulates
предложение
that,
по поводу
first of all,
политической интеграции
proposals on the
Донбасса
political integration
в украинскую
of
правовую
Donbass to the
систему
Ukrainian legal system should be
и в Конституцию.
presented
Для этого нужно
as well as to
внести
the
изменения в саму
Constitution.
Конституцию.
To this
Там
end,
так
Constitution
прописано.
should be amended.
Первое. И
It
второе,
is stipulated there.
что
That's the first thing.
границы
And
между
secondly,
Российской Федерацией и
borders between the
Украиной
Russian Federation and
по
Ukraine,
Донбасской линии начинает заниматься
the Donbass line,
пограничными войсками Украины на следующий день после проведения выборов.
this security situation should be ensured the next day after the election. That's Article 9. So what
Первым шагом
did Ukraine
вернуть вооруженные
propose?
силы
As a
Украины
first step,
к местам своей постоянной
it
дислокации.
proposed to return
Что
the
это означает?
Ukrainian
Это значит,
armed
что войска
forces to their
Украины
permanent
должны зайти на
stationing
Донбасс.
areas. That means that Ukrainian armed
Первое.
forces should
Второе, они предложили
be deployed in
закрыть
Donbass.
границу
That's the first
между
thing.
Россией
And
и Украиной
secondly,
в этой
they proposed to
части.
close Ukrainian-Russian border in
Выборы
this area.
провести через
And
3
third,
месяца
to hold
после
elections
этих двух шагов.
3 months after these two steps.
Не надо быть никаким юристом.
One doesn't need
Надо
to
иметь
be a
специальное
lawyer,
образование, чтобы
and
понять, что
one
это
doesn't
ничего
need to
общего не
have
имеет с Минским
a
соглашением.
special
Это полностью
experience to understand that it
Минским
hasn't
соглашениям противоречит. Поэтому
nothing to do with the Minsk
какие же
agreements.
здесь обязательства
It
дополнительные
contradicts
может
fully
взять
to
на
the Minsk
себя
agreements. So what kind
Россия?
of additional obligations
что
should
ответ
Russia take here?
понятен.
I believe that the
Что
answer
касается учений,
is pretty
мы проводим
understandable.
учения на
As
своей
for the
территории, так
exercises,
же,
we
как
are
Соединенные Штаты
holding
проводят
these
на своей
exercises in
территории
our
многие
territory,
учения,
just
но
like
мы
the
не
United
проводим
States
учений,
does with
подтаскивая
regard to
свою
many
технику и
drills.
личный состав к государственным границам
we
Соединенных Штатов Америки.
do not
К сожалению, наши американские
hold our
партнеры делают
exercises
это прямо
by
сейчас.
deploying the military equipment close to the US border.
озабоченности
Unfortunately,
должна быть
that's
не
what
у
the
американской
American
стороны по
partners
этому поводу,
are doing
а у
with regard
российской.
to our border.
Но это тоже
So
предмет
we need to have
разговоров
these concerns, not them, but this is the subject
выяснения
of
позиций. По
discussion
поводу
and of clarifying
нашей
positions.
несистемной оппозиции
With regard to our
и
non-systemic opposition
гражданина, о котором вы упомянули.
and
Первое.
a citizen that you have
Значит,
mentioned,
человек этот знал, что он
first, this
нарушает
person knew full
действующий в
well
России
that he
закон.
violates
Он
the
обязан был
law that
отмечаться
exists in
как
Russia, and
лицо,
he
дважды осужденное
had
к условной мере наказания.
to understand that he is a person that
игнорируя это
is a
требование
repeated
закона,
offender.
этот господин
He
выехал за границу на лечение. Его не
Deliberately
требовали
violated this law.
органы власти на
He
регистрацию.
went abroad
Как только
to
он
receive
вышел из
medical
больницы и
treatment,
разместил
and once
свои
he went out of
видеосюжеты
hospital and posted his videos
такое
online,
требование возникло. Он не
a
явился,
requirement
проигнорировал
appeared,
требования
but
закона.
he ignored
объявили в
the
розыск.
requirement of the law,
Зная об этом, он приехал.
and
Я
he
исхожу
knew
из того,
full well
что
that he is
хотел
wanted.
сознательно шел на
Nevertheless,
то, чтобы
he
быть
came
задержан.
back to Russia and he
Сделал
deliberately
то, чего он хотел.
wanted to be arrested.
Поэтому о чем здесь
So
можно
he
говорить?
did
Что
what he wanted to
касается
do.
таких,
What
как
can
он,
we say
и вообще
here with regard
системной
to
оппозиции.
persons like himself and the systemic
формат
opposition at
пресс-конференции не
large?
дает нам поговорить об
Unfortunately,
этом
the format of the
подробно.
press
Но я
conference
хотел бы сказать
does not
следующее.
allow us to have a detailed conversation of
Я
that.
думаю, ничего
But let
сложного
me
не
say the
скажу.
following.
Это будет понятно.
I believe that
Если вы
it's pretty simple and it would
сочтете
be
возможным
clear to
объективно
everyone.
донести это до ваших зрителей и
And
слушателей,
if you
я буду за
could
это вам очень
just
благодарен.
have an unbiased coverage of this,
Соединенные
I
Штаты
would appreciate it.
объявили
So
Россию
the
своим
United
врагом.
States declared Russia as its enemy and adversary,
Конгресс это сделал в 2017 году.
and the Congress made it
В
back in
законодательство Соединенных
2017.
Штатов внесены
The US
положения
legislation
о том, что
have
США должны
provisions
поддерживать
that the United States
правила и
should
порядок демократического
support the
управления в нашей
order
стране и
and
поддерживать политические организации.
rule of democratic order in our country
Это и есть
and
в вашем
support
законе.
democratic organizations.
Теперь давайте зададимся
And
вопросом.
it is all contained
Если
in your
Россия враг,
legislation. So let
то
us ask a
какие
question. If
организации
Russia is an enemy, then what kind of
будет
organizations
поддерживать Америка в
would be
России?
supported by the United States and
Я
Russia?
думаю, что не те, которые
I believe
укрепляют Российскую
these are
Федерацию,
not organizations that
а
make
те,
Russia
которые ее
stronger,
сдерживают.
but those who
А
deter
это цель
Russia.
Соединенных Штатов,
And that
заявленная
is the
публично.
goal of the United States that they made public.
Так, это организации и люди,
So these
которые
are
способствуют
organizations and
реализации
people
политики Соединенных
that
Штатов
help
на российском
implement the US
направлении.
policy on the Russian track.
Как мы должны к этому относиться?
So what
Я
should
думаю,
be
что
our take on
понятно,
this?
мы должны
I believe
относиться к
that
этому
clearly
с настороженностью,
we should be
но
cautious about
действовать
it,
будем исключительно в рамках
but
российского
we
закона.
would be guided and we would react within the Russian law.
Давайте, дайте Павлу Зарубину микрофон. А потом на Арти вернемся.
Павел Зарубин, ВГТРК. Ну вот я как раз хотел продолжить эту тематику. Мы и сейчас тоже все с вами свидетели, что с американской стороны постоянно звучит вот эта риторика о так называемых политических заключенных в России. А вот тема Навального, она вообще обсуждалась в ходе ваших переговоров с Байденом? И как обсуждалась, если обсуждалась? И еще один важный вопрос. Мы все были свидетелями, конечно, что, скажем так, новый этап в российско-американских отношениях при старте президентства Байдена начался с очень грубого высказывания в ваш адрес. Вот по этому поводу как-то удалось, может быть, объясниться? Спасибо.
Значит, президент Байден затрагивал тему прав человека и
President
людей,
Biden has
которые
indeed touched on the subject of
считают,
human
что они
rights
представляют
and the subject
эти
of
вопросы
people
в
who
Российской
think
Федерации.
who
Да, мы говорили
they
об этом по
are
его
fully
инициативе.
in tune with the subjects,
Первое. Второе,
with
по
this topic in
поводу резких
Russia. We've
заявлений.
discussed this.
Ну, что
We've discussed
сказать,
harsh
значит,
statements as
все мы
well.
знаем эти заявления. После этого президент Байден
heard
мне
them.
позвонил.
He
Мы
called me right
объяснились.
afterwards.
Меня эти
He explained
объяснения
himself,
устроили.
and I was fully all right
Он
with what
предложил
he
нам встретиться.
said.
Это
He
его
offered to meet. I mean, this
Мы
was his
встретились.
initiative. We've met.
И, повторяю, разговор был
And once again,
весьма конструктивный.
the
Я лишний раз
conversation
убедился
was
в том, что
quite
президент Байден
constructive.
человек очень опытный.
And I once again
Это совершенно очевидно. Мы с ним с
understood
глазу на
that
глаз
President
разговаривали почти 2 часа.
Biden is an experienced statesman.
Не со
Our
всеми
one-on-one
лидерами
conversation
так
took almost
подробно
2 hours.
идет разговор с
It's
глазу
not
на глаз. Что касается различного рода обвинений,
world leader that,
вспомните, его предшественник, ему задали такой же
Gets
вопрос,
this
он
amount of
уклонился.
attention. I mean, his predecessor
Действующий президент
was
США
asked the same
решил
question. He evaded
ответить
this.
таким образом.
This president decided to respond
его
to
ответ
the
отличался
question
от
directly.
ответа господина
And
Трампа.
in this, he
Вы
is
знаете,
very different from President Trump.
В принципе, все, что происходит в наших
look at
странах,
it this
так
way.
или иначе,
Everything that
за это
happens in our
несет
countries
ответственность политическое
is something
руководство.
that
И
political
первые
leadership
лица.
is responsible for.
Вот по поводу
and
того,
the
кто
presidents
и где,
included.
и в чем виноват, кто убийца. Вы
Who
посмотрите,
stands
на улицах
accused of
американских
what,
городов
who's the
каждый
killer?
день
But
кого-то
look at it
убивают,
this way.
в том числе
Look at the American streets.
и лидеров различных
People are
организаций.
getting killed there,
Там слова не
including
успеешь сказать,
those who
уже стреляют. Либо
are
в руки, либо
leading
в спину.
leading
Вне зависимости от того, рядом с тобой дети
various
или человек
political
просто,
organizations.
вот
You
я
can get a
помню,
bullet in the back of
бросила
your
машину
neck.
женщина, побежала, ей в спину стреляют, застрелили.
A woman
Значит,
just
ну ладно,
ran
это
away from
криминальные
police and
вещи.
they shot her in the back.
Афганистан возьмем.
But
Там одним
take
ударом по
Afghanistan.
120 человек убивали. Свадьбу
One
уничтожали.
single
Раз,
strike
два.
can kill to the
Допустим,
tune of
это
120 people.
Такое тоже
All right,
бывает.
assuming this was a mistake,
Но
it
расстрел
happens
из
on a war.
беспилотников или,
But
или
shooting
с
from a drone
вертолетов.
at an
Явно
unarmed
гражданских
crowd,
лиц в Ираке.
clearly the
Явно
civilian
гражданских
crowd,
лиц. Это что такое?
what is this about?
Ну,
How would you
кто
call
несет за
that?
это ответственность?
And who's responsible for this?
Кто убийца?
And how would you call this person who is the killer
И по
now?
правам человека.
Or going back to the human rights
Но
record.
Гуантанамо до сих пор работает.
The Guantanamo
Вообще
prison
не
is still
соответствует
operating.
ничему.
It doesn't even start to resemble what is stipulated in the
Ничему.
international law or in the US legislation. And yet it exists.
Тюрьмы ЦРУ, которые были открыты в
Secret
разных странах,
CIA
в том числе
prisons across the globe, including those in the European countries, where people were tortured.
права человека?
Well, is this the great human rights record?
Думаю, что нет. Правда?
Oh, I doubt
Вряд ли
that.
кто-то из сидящих в зале согласится, что так
Would
защищают
anyone
права
here
человека.
would agree
Это же
that this is how
практика.
you protect the human rights?
Реальной
But
политики.
these are facts on the
Мы,
ground.
исходя из этих
And
практик,
this is the
понимаем,
reality
что это
of the
делалось
politics
и
today. And
может
we
делаться.
understand
Выстраивали свое
that
отношение к тому,
this is
о
how
чем я
it's
считаю, что
been done.
делать,
And
в том числе и к тем лицам,
on the basis of
которые
that, we
получают
respond.
деньги из-за рубежа, чтобы
So when
отстаивать
people get funding
интересы
from
тех,
abroad
кто им платит.
to stand for the hidden
Продолжаем.
agenda of
Арти,
those
пожалуйста.
who are paying them, who pays the piper. RT now,
Мурат
please.
Газдиев, РТ. Вопрос про
RT, a question about the Arctic. You've mentioned the discussion on this track, and the United States have been accusing Russia of militarizing the Arctic. And so do the United States allies. In March, State Secretary Blinken voiced his concern. So what have you discussed in detail? Well, we've discussed this in an extended format with our aides present, and this is an interesting field. I mean, the exploration of the Arctic and in general and of Northern Sea route in particular is of huge interest for many countries, not just us in the United States. So yes, the United States have concerns, but they are completely baseless. I mean, these concerns about the militarization are baseless. We are not doing anything new. We are simply restoring the infrastructure that has already been there. All right, we are retooling this, we are retrofitting this, the borderline infrastructure, the military infrastructure, but also the environment conservation and emergency command and search and rescue infrastructure. We are creating the capacity to save people at sea. If that, God forbid, happens, or we're trying to protect the environment. I've told our colleagues that I see no grounds for concern whatsoever. Quite the opposite. I think there's plenty of ground for cooperation, and we should cooperate in this. After all, Russia and the United States are one of the 8 members of the Arctic Council. And by the way, Russia chairs the Arctic Council this year. Moreover, as you probably know, there's a strait between Alaska and Chukotka. On one side you have the United States, and other Russia. All this taken together should actually prompt us to work together to redouble the effort. And the use of Northern Sea route, its use is regulated by the international law. There are 2 major regulations. It's the law of the sea of the United Nations, that dates back to 1982, if I'm not mistaken, and the Polar Code, which is comprised of several documents, which was ratified in 2017. So that's the legal framework. So I drew the attention of our counterparts to this and to the fact that we, Russia, fully stand ready to stand by these international regulations. We have never infringed upon any of them. We stand ready to lend a helping hand to all the countries and companies who wish to explore the possibilities of Northern Sea route. Now the navigation is open for half a year, but in fact it's more than that. And as the planet warms, this navigation will be open for a longer time. New icebreakers, including the Leader icebreaker, are put online, and we have the mightiest icebreaker fleet in the world. So this proves the much demand for the use of Northern Sea route. Now, the law of the sea of the United Nations describes and sets the legal framework in and around of the international waters, territorial waters of the country, adjacent seas, exclusive economic zone, and the freedom of the sea, the internal seas. What is that? These are the seas that lie within the sovereign territory of the country. Then the territorial sea, 12 miles, adjacent sea, 12 more miles. In terms of adjacent seas, on the country in question should give the right of passage, the free and peaceful right of passage, even to the military ships. Well, do we object? No, we don't. Now, the internal seas is something different. We're not obliged to provide anyone anything. But bear in mind this, the territory of the internal seas, I think it's, well, 5 of them, the Obsk territory, Pskov, the Bay, and some others. The length of this is to the tune of 1,000 nautical miles. Well, this is a sovereign right that we enjoy, whether we want to give the right of passage. But we're not abusing this right. Last year alone we had 1,000 requests to cross them. And I think we've only rejected 10 requests, and the majority of them is the ships that fly the Russian flag. And the regulating agencies deem them unfit to comply with the Polar Code. And the Polar Code itself, Polar Code proper, defines and spells out the requirements for the ships that are crossing these seas. So take us all together, the stakeholder states, members of the Nordic Council. We can do much good together. There are plenty of things for concerns and for contradictions, but I think that there's no issue that cannot be solved if we engage in an earnest effort. NTV, Rada.
Good relations, or at least not poor relations, between Russia and America were always the guarantor of calm international relations. And you talked with Biden. Biden agreed on some matters. Now you're talking about respect. You said that your talks were characterized by that. Before the talks, you talked about red lines. And Americans have some red lines. During the talks, were you able to reach an agreement about not crossing the red lines in all areas? Is that something that would improve the relations or at least stabilize the relations? Well, I can say that on the whole, we understand what our American partners are saying. They understood what we were saying. I mean, when we're talking about red lines. But I have to be frank. Of course, we didn't get to the point where we were talking in depth about where the line would be drawn. We talked about work on cybersecurity. We talked about strategic stability. I think that during these consultations, incidentally, also all of this should be discussed, and I hope that we can agree upon it. I'm including the Arctic matters in that too. ABC News, our American branch.
Mr. President, thank you so much for taking my question. President Biden has said that he would respond if cyber attacks from Russia do not stop. I'm curious, what did he tell you? Did he make any threats? And a quick follow-up, if I may, sir. The list of your political opponents who are dead, imprisoned, or jailed is long. Alexei Navalny's organization calls for free and fair elections, an end to corruption. But Russia has outlawed that organization, calling it extremist. And you have now prevented anyone who supports him to run for office. So my question is, Mr. President, what are you so afraid of?
Okay. Once more, let me reiterate what was already said about various so-called foreign agents and about people who are positioning themselves as the non-systemic opposition. I already answered your colleague from CNN, right? But this is the law of the genre, so I have to answer your question, please. I'll do it again. The United States has adopted a law in accordance with which the U.S. has said that they will support various political organizations in Russia. At the same time, they made an announcement that the Russian Federation is an enemy. They've spoken publicly, saying that they will restrain the development of Russia. Here's a question. What organizations, what political organizations of the United States and other members of the Western community, which organizations should be supported in Russia, especially if they're paying for them? We're just like the Americans back, the way the Americans did back in the 1930s. We're calling them foreign agents. But it's not prohibited. They're not prohibited from working. They can continue to operate. Foreign agents don't need to stop operating. If they are extremist in nature, then that's another issue. The organization that you mentioned has publicly called for mass disorder. They have publicly called for breaking the law, called for minors to participate in activities that were against the law, and they were talking about using Molotov cocktails against the authorities as well, including against police. America just recently had very severe events after well-known events after a killing of an African American. And an entire movement developed known as Black Lives Matter. I'm not going to comment on that, but here's what I do want to say. What we saw was disorder, destruction, violations of the law, etc. We feel sympathy for the United States of America, but we don't want that to happen on our territory. And we're doing our utmost in order to not allow it to happen. And some fears that has nothing to do with anything. Please. Could you give me the microphone, please?
You didn't answer my question, sir. If all of your political opponents are dead, in prison, poisoned, doesn't that send a message that you do not want a fair political fight?
As for who is killing whom or throwing whom in jail, people came to the U.S. Congress with political demands. 400 people. Over 400 people had criminal charges placed on them. They faced prison sentences of up to 20, maybe even 25 years. They're being called domestic terrorists. They're being accused of a number of other crimes. 70 of them were arrested right away after the events, and 30 of them are still under arrest. It's unclear on what grounds. And as for nobody from the official authorities has informed us about it. Some people died, and one of the people that died, they were simply shot on the spot by the police, although they were not threatening the police with any weapons. In many countries, the same thing happens in our country. I'd like to stress once more that we sympathize with what happened in the United States, but we have no desire to allow the same thing to happen in our country. Just a couple of more questions, because later the President will continue his program. Please hand over the microphone.
Удалось ли с американской стороной договориться о возвращении некоторых россиян,
которые побывали в наказании в американских тюрьмах? Если да, то когда это может произойти? Спасибо. American prisons? If yes, then when will it happen? We talked about it. President Biden raised that question. The question about American citizens that were in Russian prisons. We discussed that. There could be some compromise that we enter into between the Russian Foreign Ministry and the U.S. State Department. They will be working on it.
Давайте еще вот телеканал России заключительный вопрос.
The Russia channel. Russia 1. You said that you discussed trade with Mr. Biden. That's probably the most positive agenda. Business from both ends are interested in development. What are the prospects that you see here? Thank you. This doesn't depend on us. It depends on the Americans. We haven't leveled any restrictions. What I think is after some restrictions were introduced in the economy and in commerce, I think that was done much more by the U.S. than by Russia. Yes, this did affect some of our development, The U.S. is carrying out their task of restraining Russia, but they didn't have any critical effect. That's number one. Number two, this has to do with the interests of American businesses. 200 people, the biggest delegation of Americans. It was an American delegation. That delegation was at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. Some restrictions were introduced, including for American companies. Due to that, some of the American companies have lost out. They've given up the business into the hands of their competitors from other countries. We talked about that. What for? There's no practical reason, but there are losses. As for our trade with the U.S., I think it's $28 billion, roughly, in the first. It increased by 16% in the first quarter of this year. If this trend continues, I think that will be a benefit for everybody. Sure, you know what, let's have a couple of questions from here and a couple of questions from here, all right? The lady here, please. Andrei, let the lady ask a question. Mr. President, thank you very much for affording me the opportunity to ask you a question. A few years ago, you met President Biden. That was when he was vice president. What he said was that he looked you in the eye, and he said that he didn't see a soul. And you said, that means we understand one another. Did you, tell me please, did you look him in the eye and what did you see there? Did you see a person with whom you can work? And please tell me, President Biden, did he invite you to visit the Russian White House? And if, the White House rather, and if yes, did you agree to go to the White House? President Biden did not invite me as his guest. I didn't invite him either. I think for visits like that, for meetings like that, you need to have the proper conditions. You need to be ready. As for the soul, seeing it or not seeing something, well, this isn't the first time I've heard this. Frankly speaking, I don't recall this conversation, but I will allow that it happened and it escaped my attention. But if you ask me, what sort of a partner, what sort of a conversational partner Biden is, I'd say he's very constructive, he's very balanced, just the way that I expected. He's very experienced, you can tell that at first glance. But he talked about his family, recalling them. He talked about what his mom said. You know, these are important things. They're not directly related to any matters directly, but it shows the extent of his moral values, and that's all quite attractive. And what I think is, on the whole, we spoke the same language. That doesn't mean that we necessarily have to look into our eyes, look into our souls. We need to have eternal friendship and love, but no, we have to represent our countries. And the relationship is a pragmatic one, primarily. Yes, please. Andrei Kolesnikov from Kommersant, the newspaper. Mr. Putin, based on the outcome of this meeting, did you have any new illusions? Well, I didn't have any old illusions. What about new ones? No illusions, there are no illusions, and there could not be any illusions. Okay, over here, raising your hand. Yeah. Please. Give her the microphone. The young lady can decide herself whom to give the microphone to. Hello, I'm from the channel Zvezda. Mr. Putin, a question about global climate change. Did you speak with President Biden about that? And the second question has to do with American media. Recently, you gave a big interview to NBC. Do you think that it is fair to give the American president do you think it's fair to give an interview to the American media when it doesn't happen the other way around? And how do you feel about having your words always being distorted? You know what? About the distortion, about silencing things, well, that is the practice in international relations today. What can you do? Can't do anything about it. We've gotten used to that a long time ago, and we're all living with it. We've been living with it for decades. As for who is giving an interview, that decision is taken by the relevant leaders or countries. And if you want to convey something in addition to people, then, well, we try to do that. I gave an interview to the American press, and that's exactly what I was trying to do there. As for the activities of our mass media in general, for example, President Biden raised the question about freedom, about the freedom of Europe and Russia, I think, or rather Radio Free Europe, which we called a foreign agent. Biden broached that. Before that, there were other media outlets. There's also Sputnik, a media outlet working abroad. And before that, the United States called Sputnik a foreign agent. And what we did in response, what we did with regard to the Voice of America. And this is done in accordance with the law, registration, etc. And a lot of problems have been created for our personnel with money transfers and that sort of thing. We don't have that kind of a problem. And for American medias, the American media hasn't complied with all of the requirements of Russian law. I think that even here, we can work through the ministries of foreign affairs to resolve matters. Let's go over here, sure. Okay, I was referring to the lady there. But sure, yeah, you can go next. Thank you very much. Galina Polonska from Euronews. Galina Polonska, Euronews. We all saw you shake Joe Biden's hand at the very beginning. Here's my question. Were you able to bring mutual understanding and trust to a different level with the President of the United States? Do you think it's realistic at this juncture to have a new level of relations when it's where they're absolutely clear and transparent? And will there be an understanding of where both countries need to go to? Let me tell you, in life, there is no happiness. There's only the specter of happiness. I think in this situation, there's not like family-based trust. But I think that there was some specter of trust that we caught a glimpse of. Please. Please, the microphone. You already have a microphone. You want a second one, huh? This one wasn't turned on. Thank you. The coronavirus is one of the most important issues on the planet now. Was this issue discussed with the American president? And if yes, what are the prospects for joint work with the Americans in order to curb this plague? And perhaps you talked about mutual recognition of vaccines. We did talk about that, but we only touched on it tangentially. We answered a request by the Americans to send our equipment as humanitarian assistance. You know, America is a big, powerful country. And it's not like they don't have money. Just at that point, they really needed our equipment, and we did it free of charge. And we're prepared to continue cooperation on these lines in the future, but we didn't talk about it in general. We didn't talk about it in detail, rather, today. With regard to President Trump, after those meetings, the relations between the two countries deteriorated further. Is there any indication that that won't happen again? Did we reach in our relationship with the U.S. some sort of a low point that we can push off from and go up? That's difficult to say now. That's because all of the activities that have to do with worsening the relations, all of the actions that did that were not initiated by us. I don't know. Please.
Alexander Gamov, Komsomolskaya Pravda.
Alexander Ganov, Komsomolskaya Pravda. I'm not sure if you know, but our team won. Congratulations.
Допустим, с таких же позиций встречу Байдена и Путина. Какой счет у этой встречи?
So what do you think is the score in the Putin-Biden meeting? And the second question. The Americans, before coming to Geneva, they kept on saying, we're going to put pressure on Putin, we're going to put pressure on Russia. Did you feel that pressure? Was there any conflict? That's probably the most important question that Russia's interested in. That's it, I think. Another thing. You know, I think that's pretty much enough. I think so too. We didn't experience any pressure, although there was a candid and open conversation, and there were no personal or diplomatic deviations from the topics we set out to address. So let me repeat once more. There was no pressure from either side. It would be senseless to do that, too. That's not the reason why people meet each other. What was the first part of your question? Oh, the score. Well, I think before our meeting, President Biden said that it wasn't a sporting event, and I fully agree with that. What's the point of keeping score? The meeting had results. It was substantive. It was concrete. And it took place in an atmosphere that was geared toward achieving results. First and foremost, the specter of trust that our colleague from Euronews talked about. Please, BBC News, go ahead. Thank
Stephen
you.
Rosenberg, BBC News. Vladimir Vladimirovich, Joe Biden
Joe Biden is calling for stable, predictable relations with Russia. But on the West, it's believed that the unpredictability is a feature of Russian foreign policy. Are you prepared to renounce unpredictability for the sake of improving relations with the West? Thank you. I envy you for the level of artistry you've achieved here. So, turning to the first, as for the first question, do you think, and then the second question, are you, the first question, the West considers, and secondly, are you prepared to renounce it? Just because the West believes that to be the case, it doesn't mean that it is the case. Let's turn to the first part of the question. You said that the West believes that Russia's foreign policy is unpredictable. Let me answer that. When the U.S. exited the ABM treaty for no reason, why did they do that? That had an effect on strategic stability, and now the withdrawal from the INF in 2012. What's stable about that? There's nothing stable about that at all. Withdrawal from the Open Skies Treaty. What's stable there? There's practically nothing left. But luckily, Joe Biden is addressing the area of strategic stability. He has made quite a sound decision to extend the START treaty. Wow. Let's take the situation surrounding Ukraine and Crimea. Everybody's dancing around that, right? What is stable about the fact that a state coup d'etat was organized in Ukraine when President Yanukovych agreed with all of the demands of the opposition? He was prepared, in essence, to leave power and to hold new elections? No. No. There was a need to carry out a bloody coup d'etat, which led to results that are well known, and well known in East Ukraine. And you think that we're unpredictable? No, I don't think so. In my view, we are acting absolutely appropriately to counter threats that are emerging against us. And I think for the situation to be truly stable, we need to reach an agreement on proper rules of conduct in all the areas that we talked about: strategic stability, cybersecurity, tackling issues that have to do with regional conflicts. I think that we can reach an agreement on everything. At least today, the impression arose, that impression arose based on the outcome of our meeting, my meeting with Mr. Biden.
Синий туман, обман. Сейчас песни начнут
What?
петь. Но нас
We're going to start
не
singing
поймут
songs
ваши,
now. Blue fog, deceit. Well, now our foreign colleagues aren't going to understand that reference. Okay, let's give the floor to one of the foreign outlets, Bloomberg, please. I have a follow-up question.
Bloomberg News или Архипов? Владимир Владимирович,
Bloomberg News.
Вот у вас в 2016 году после
Mr.
встречи с Трампом
In 2016, you met with Trump. After that, American sanctions were adopted. Well, the latest round were adopted very quickly. Did you talk with Joe Biden about the guarantees you would have for these sanctions to be lifted, or rather for new sanctions not to be introduced against Russia? And you said that there's some incipient hope with regard to Biden. You mentioned some initial agreements. Do you have more trust that he'll be able to do it? Because it's believed that the American administration has more solidarity with the American president than was the case during Donald Trump's term. You talked about cybersecurity. You had consultations on Ukraine. I wasn't sure, was there a working group on cybersecurity? And you talked about some red lines. Did you lay out the red lines specifically about that? Can you tell us about that? Well, let's turn to the red lines. I've already addressed that many times. The understanding arises during negotiations on key areas of our interaction. It makes no sense to try to scare one another. When people sit down at the negotiating table in order to establish relations, not to intimidate each other. As for these sanctions,
Я уже сказал, мы не знаем, каково настроение там внутриполитические, не знаем расклад сил. То есть мы знаем, но мы не можем до деталей там понять происходящие события.
We know the general situation, but we can't say what's happening in detail. So there's some who are against Russian development. There's some who are proponents of it. It's difficult to say which side is prevailing. But if after our meeting some steps are taken, the ones that you recalled in 2016, then what will that mean? That will mean that will mean that we've lost the latest opportunity. Please. One final question from a journalist from Canada.
I'm Tamara Teresco from Radio-Canada. You said to a couple of my colleagues you wanted unbiased. Do you have a translation?
No.
Do you hear me now?
No.
По-русски?
Не хотят Канаду включить.
Yeah, they didn't want to.
Нет перевода.
There's no interpretation. I can't hear it.
I will try and repeat.
Сейчас, может, на другой канал перейдут. Попробуйте.
Maybe you will try on a different channel.
Нет, я не слышу.
Yeah? Nope, I can't hear anything. I don't hear anything whatsoever.
Сейчас, секундочку.
1 second.
Извините, пожалуйста.
Sorry.
Есть звук. Повторите, пожалуйста, сначала.
Thank you.
Sorry, please, if you wouldn't mind repeating.
Tamara Teresco from Radio-Canada in Moscow. You said to a couple of my colleagues you wanted unbiased, fair questions and coverage. I have a fair question for you. It actually comes from my 9-year-old daughter, who asked me before I left to come here, what is the big deal with this summit? And it's quite a complicated answer for a 9-year-old. So I'd like you to explain to us, in your own words, Mr. President, why is this relationship so complicated? And also, she'd like to know, and I'd like to know, why are young people not allowed to protest in Russia?
Да, это здорово, что ваша
пятилетняя дочь интересуется этими вопросами. It's great that your 9-year-old daughter is interested in these questions. The answer is very simple.
Вокруг себя и сказать, видишь, как прекрасно.
You need to look around yourself. You need to see how beautiful the world is.
Взрослые люди, руководители двух стран.
And adults, the leaders of 2 countries, the biggest nuclear powers, are meeting. They're doing that in order to make the world safer, more reliable, and a place for everyone, a home for everyone to flourish, for all those who live on our planet. And they're doing that, they're addressing issues that have to do with a terrible weapon, which needs to be limited. They need to draw up common rules on refraining from using those weapons. They talked about protecting the environment, about rivers being clean, about seas being clean, about there not being any floods, not being any droughts, about providing food to everyone on the planet, no matter where they are. They'll talk about issues of healthcare, so that when children grow up, they get sick less often, they have the opportunity to study, and they have the opportunity to look at the future confidently. And I hope that at our meeting, I hope that you will cover our meeting based on those considerations in particular. I thank you for your attention. All the best.